Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special edition of the Walden Champions and Greg podcast, where we're going to, rather than addressing a race, because we already did the Hungary review, we're just going to talk a little bit about the future of the sport. So the episode won't be quite as long tonight, but we're hoping to get through a little bit of things. We did have a special guest lined up tonight in Matt, but unfortunately, despite having this idea, he hasn't showed up. So it's going to be the normal panel of a couple of champions and Greg. So we'll just step straight into it. Welcome to the panel, Luce. Good evening, Luce.
Hi.
And Greg.
Hello.
You'll get that elusive championship one day, Greg, and then we can change the name of the podcast.
Sure, I've won something somewhere.
No, you can't remember it, so too bad.
I won the first XGN Again Championship.
Yeah, but that's
before
the
we bought
McCain
it.
Championship. That doesn't count.
Okay.
Always got to qualify these things. Which ones count, which ones don't. All right. Well, we'll just step straight into it. As we said, there's a special edition tonight. We're just going to talk about the future of the sport, because I think that for a number of people, Formula One faces a crossroads in terms of its future. And we, as a couple of armchair experts, would like to share...
Experts, come on.
Okay, we'll take the armchair bit out then, just to talk about what we think the sport should do. So, without further ado, gentlemen, is the first thing the sport should do be chase Jolly and Palmer out at the first opportunity? Greg, go.
Well,
I see a future without Jolly and Palmer. It's coming. It's either going to be sooner or later.
and Luce.
well, that's not really a decision for F1 to make. That's more Renault, but let us hope.
Have you ever seen that? Have you ever seen a picture of that stick man with the picture of the joke going over his head? That's you,
Yes.
Luce. That's you.
Yes. No, I do get the joke, but
He's left that joke on middle.
He's Michael Clarked it. It's taken out middle stop. The barrel's gone flying. The stop's gone back. Yeah, it's backtracking so fast it's become a hazard to the keeper. All right. So the real first question is: does Formula One face significant competition from Formula E? What we've seen recently is that a number of the engine manufacturers, Mercedes, Renault's already been in there for a while, actually looking more at Formula E as a racing series. And does Formula One, with its current regulations around hybrid, does it risk actually positioning itself too close to Formula E, but then losing all its competitors to Formula E? So at which point we'll have no fans and no manufacturers. So we'll open up the debate with that one. And I smell something that's affecting my nose, so I sound strange at the moment. So we'll start with you, Luce. What do you think of F1 and Formula E?
well, I don't think it's an immediate threat. Certainly, probably, I don't know, maybe a decade, maybe 20, 15 years, something like that. There will be a point where there'll probably be a crossover point, or there might be a crossover point between the two series as Formula One becomes less reliant, or seemingly less reliant on, naturally aspirated engines and the like, and more towards electric. But yeah, at the same time, I don't want F1 to sort of go that way, if you know what I mean. I sort of want it to have its own identity, so to speak, and it's going to need to change for it to find itself again, because I think the last few years it's sort of lost itself, and that's why you see teams now, or manufacturers, going to Formula E. It's a cheaper alternative, and it's easy for them to put their brand out, while Formula One, it's not as easy to do that now.
Right, and Greg, how do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, if in response to the first part of your question, is the competition it faces from Formula E. As a motor racing purist, I don't think it's facing much competition in the way of an exciting motorsport to watch at this stage. Where it does face competition is in terms of road relevance. It would seem that Formula E, whether you think it's technically true or not, from a marketability point of view, is certainly going to be more road relevant in the next 10 years. which means it's got much more competition for interest from the manufacturers. I guess the question is, which we've talked about off air, is whether Formula One needs these manufacturers or not, or whether it can be something entirely on its own that doesn't necessarily have to be road relevant.
Right, and I guess that's probably what my position is on that question, is that I honestly think that F1 pandering to these manufacturers is a fool's gambit. That actually, they brought in hybrid rules in order to satisfy Renault, in order to satisfy Mercedes, to keep them associated with the sport, and I can't help but think. Obviously, they changed the hybrids. It attracted Honda, and there was talk of the Volkswagen Group coming in until they had their emissions fall out. But I can't help but feel that F1, in terms of actually attempting to pander to these manufacturers, has actually done nothing except alienate a core of its fan base. And in the end, it will be all for naught anyway, because the manufacturers themselves are just going to up and leave and go to Formula E. And the reason that I say that is that there will come a time in the not too distant future where hybrid, in the same way that petrol engines are now considered to be archaic, hybrid itself will also be considered archaic. And in fact, full electric engines will in fact be the way to go. And this will happen as Tesla becomes the mainstream, and when these manufacturers are actually looking to push their technology, I find it difficult to believe that they would favour a hybrid formula over an electric formula in that scenario. And I guess that's what my position on it is, that Formula One may very well, like I said before, position itself too closely to Formula E, to not be enough of a differentiator from Formula E, but lose manufacturer support as they all go full electric. And I guess that segues into what my next question would be, which is, what do you think Formula One should do with the upcoming regulation change to the engines, I think in 2021, when the current regulations are up for review? Should they maintain hybrid? Should they maintain the current course? Should they look to go even more technologically advanced, which would probably take them even closer to Formula E? Or should they actually regress into an older formula in order to drive a wedge of differentiation to Formula E? And I'll ask you that first, Greg.
Well, I think the last option's probably not on the table. I don't think we've ever really seen Formula One take a step. You could call it a step back. Many of us would call it a step in the right direction. But I don't think they're going to go that way with naturally aspirated engines. But I mean, probably the most conservative thing they could do is simplify the engine architecture a little bit with the hybrid systems. They may choose to keep them, or maybe they won't. But what I think will probably happen is some kind of simplified engine that's still turbocharged, that has some kind of energy recovery. It might not be the MGU-H, it might just be the MGU-K. But the main thing that they need to do, that is most important, is that the engine needs to be affordable and viable for an independent manufacturer to build it. So that means it needs to be cheap enough for some, like a Cosworth or someone that's not a road car manufacturer. It's not their primary business. And I think that would go some way in the short to medium term in securing the future of the sport.
And so, asking you the same question now, Luce, and adding to that, is Greg right? Have they made are the current regulations? How would you gauge the price effectiveness of the current regulations? Is it actually the price point that they've got, is it keeping smaller engine makers out of the sport?
It's certainly keeping the small engine manufacturers out. Obviously, there was, we've had talk over the last few years of new engine manufacturers coming, and it just doesn't seem to happen for a variety of reasons. And I think obviously one of those reasons has to be it's just too expensive. Obviously, and then it doesn't help that we've seen Honda come in a year later with, they've had to start from the ground up while other teams had a year in advance in 2014 to sort of figure something out, or in Mercedes' case, 55,000 years to make something, and they've had to try and do it on the go and have just failed miserably. And Honda, while I guess in the mid 2000s weren't overly successful, obviously they're not a company that really makes horrendously bad race cars. I mean, and engines. So it's not like they've come from nothing. I mean, they've got experience to do this stuff, but they've failed miserably. And I think it just comes down to, obviously, you've got overly complex engines, and then it doesn't help that these engines are, obviously really expensive. And then this has sort of trickled down to teams that don't run or don't have their own engines, where we've seen Red Bull try to find, obviously they've built decent chassis, but they can't get an engine that's going to make them competitive in this formula. So that frustrates them. And it just keeps, Mercedes and Ferrari to some, at arm's length. And I think if there's no cheaper alternatives or cheaper, obviously rules brought into place to, help these other engine manufacturers come in, I think it's just going to push the smaller teams away. And Formula One, it could be struggle, because obviously I reckon that Mercedes eventually going to leave, and Honda, the way it's going there, that they'll end up leaving.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I mean, I think that the current regulations are far too expensive, particularly for, first of all, from a customer perspective, to the point where they have to actually regulate through the regulations. Well, that makes sense. Regulate through regulations. They actually have to mandate through the regulations how much a customer can actually be charged for an engine. Mercedes argue, well, we should be charging them more because they're expensive, and it's. Formula One's always had that old adage, which is, in Formula One you don't need to be, spending a lot of money doesn't mean you'll win, but in order to win you must spend a lot of money. So I think that, having these really complicated, expensive power units rather than engines is stifling for the smaller teams, and I actually think it increases the advantage that manufacturer teams have. I mean, obviously, we saw from 2010 through to 2013 a customer team. It was basically a factory team, but Red Bull win the constructors' championships. But it's very difficult to picture anybody other than Mercedes or Ferrari at this point really nailing these regulations, because I think, as Luce said, the power unit regulations are just far too complex, and I think plays to the favor of the manufacturers. The more complex the engine regulations, the more it favors the manufacturers, because obviously they've got their fancy programs and aren't necessarily shared with everybody. They got their fancy lubricant and petroleum deals that aren't necessarily shared with their customers. I think that the sport would be much better suited to a more simple engine formula. So I guess that leads to the next question, which is, we obviously went that they're going to change regulations, but to step back, as you said, Greg, which is something Formula One's unlikely to do. There's an old proverb that says if you're moving in the wrong direction, going backwards is actually the way forward. So I guess the question I would pose is, has the hybrid era been good for the sport? Now, I know you both want to chime in and say no, because Mercedes has dominated and it's been the most uncompetitive era that any of us have ever seen up until this year. But has the technology that the hybrid era has brought to the sport been good for it, or has the trade-off been too high in terms of first of all the noise, which a lot of fans are really, really critical of, and just the complexity of watching a race? And I think the other thing that plays into that is the what I think is draconian usage or component usage regulations that, to be honest, to me, just seem silly. The whole, you can only use four 4 of each one of these components throughout the season, you start taking grid penalties. Has the harsh introduction of grid penalties, the complexity of the hybrid system, the changes it's made to the sport, particularly when thinking of the sound, have those changes been good for the sport, or has the trade-off been too high? And I'll let you answer that one first, Luce.
Well, I wanted to just chime in halfway through that. It's been,
I know.
it's been a complete failure as far as I'm concerned. It's just we've got obviously a massive power advantage from teams that run their own engines to customers. Obviously, the cost is insane. We've come out of an era where, which a lot of people forget, and they think Red Bull flat out smashed everybody, but it was closer than what. It was the closest era. We've come from the closest era Formula One's ever had, and we've now gone to these new engines, which are obviously they sound terrible. They're overly complex, and you've got these rules where they're just going to penalise anyone who, or new manufacturers that come to the sport, as we've seen with Honda with their 400 place grid penalties at certain tracks and the like. So I think obviously a step in like even with V8 engines, like it would be while it would seem like a step back, I think it would be a step forward in terms of allowing closer racing between cars and teams. But at the same time, I would allow it to open up the engine regulations to a certain degree so it appeals to, obviously manufacturers.
Switching to you now then, Greg, to answer that question. And I would add on the end of that, Luce's last comment there, which I think is really important, where doing things that actually appeal to other manufacturers. Do you think that that's a viable strategy, or should F1 give up on trying to make manufacturers happy and instead make the sport accessible to privateer engine makers?
Difficult question, but I mean, in the longer term, like you said, manufacturers come and go. It's really only been independent teams and the so-called, I think they're called garagistas, that have really persisted. McLaren's an example of that. So I think it needs to really appeal to the privateer rather than the manufacturer. I know it seems.
I did word that wrong. I mean, I was sort of, maybe not manufacturers probably wasn't the right word, but certainly, privateer engine makers, Cosworth, so to speak.
Yeah, I know that's where I was going with that as well. It sort of seems sacrosanct because, I mean, we've all sort of grown up in an era of manufacturers supporting Formula One. But I mean, we've talked about it. We've all talked about it, and Ross Brawn said, stuff like, if we're going to be road relevant, the road industry is heading in the direction of autonomous cars. So I mean, how road relevant do you want to make it? How happy do you want the manufacturers to be that the sport's road relevant? So it's at a Formula One is, like you've said, at a crossroads. It has to decide whether it wants to be this niche motorsport, sort of archaic, old form of sport, I suppose, or whether it goes the full tech route.
And how do you gauge the hybrid era itself in terms of, the key points being obviously has it been good for the appeal of the sport in terms of the cars? So that includes the sound and the look.
No, I don't think so.
Has the technology brought good things to the sport?
I don't think so. The only regulation that's really had the desired effect, I think, is the fuel flow meter. I thought that was a great regulation because it's something you didn't really see much of, but it forced the manufacturers to, develop power through efficiency, which I thought was a really good thing. But whether we needed all these complex energy recovery systems, whether we needed to stifle the noise with the turbocharger, I don't think it was worth it. The racing was pretty good. It was pretty close, like Lewis said, at the end of the V8 era. So I don't think it was worth it, to be honest, because a large part of Formula One's appeal, I think, was the sound. I mean, you get used to these things, so it's hard to look back at it in retrospect. But I'm used to the sound. I haven't actually been to a race, so I can't say whether I've personally experienced being underwhelmed by it. But on TV, you don't really notice so much. It's been interesting to see the engine battle again and see how those developments play out. But ultimately, I don't think it was good for the sport. Hamilton fans be damned. It just hasn't been that close. Mercedes, and the thing that's made it all the more worse was the token system, I think. So I don't understand why you'd
screwed over everybody that wasn't Mercedes.
Yeah, I don't understand why you'd unfreeze the engine freeze from the V8 era, give everyone an opportunity to build a massive advantage, and then immediately freeze it again. That just doesn't seem right to me. So
I think
they've made a lot of poor choices, more poor choices than good choices for the sport.
I think if I had to pick out the biggest fail of the hybrid era, it is the token system.
Yeah.
The concept of introducing the most complex racing engines that certainly a Formula Series had ever seen. I don't want to say motor racing, because obviously the technology in the prototype cars,
it's a little bit more advanced. Yeah.
Yeah. So. But I think the token system was the biggest fail. The concept of introducing complex engines and then immediately restricting your ability to actually get those engines right. I mean, it was absolutely 100% predictable that one of the manufacturers was going to nail it. One of them was going to do it right, better than everyone else. It was highly unlikely that Ferrari, Mercedes, and Renault were going to go in with their very first spec of engine or power unit
and all be close.
And all be close. Like, someone was going to do it. It was going to be Mercedes. Obviously, history tells us it was Mercedes, but it could have been Ferrari. It could have been Renault, and the result would have been the same. The token system would have restricted the development and the other manufacturers to catch up. And I do wonder that if it had been Ferrari that got it right, whether and playing devil's advocate, whether the sport would have acted faster to diminish that advantage. Whereas, because it was Mercedes and Formula One was so desperate for Mercedes to buy heavily into the sport, hence why they changed the regulations in the first place, that they allowed them their 3 years of utter domination of the sport.
Yeah, I'd say so, because I mean, when Ferrari were dominating, there were rule changes almost year on year. I mean, they completely threw out the tyre regs. In
changed qualifying,
restricted testing.
Restricted testing. Red Bull, they were constantly trying to pick them up on all their aero innovations that were giving them the edge. You know, there wasn't a week that went by without Marsh carrying on about flexi floors or blown diffusers or something like that.
It is funny that all of a sudden we have a competition again this year, and those noises are starting to be made again, but this time's towards Ferrari. So, I mean, I'm not one of these tinfoil sort of
Buys.
the sort of conspiracy theorists, but Mercedes were treated with kid gloves. I mean, I'm old enough to remember what Formula One was like going back to the 80s, and you had Williams in the early 90s with their active suspension immediately banned after a season of domination. You know, you had like you said, there was continual changes made to curb teams dominating the sport. And obviously we said the worst, the most blatant of it was with Ferrari. Through those 5 years from 2000 to 2004, where they changed everything to try and stop Ferrari from winning. They, like you said, they changed the tires, they changed testing, they changed. That was when they put in place to replace the V10s with V8s.
Qualifying.
Qualifying. Yeah. There was a new qualifying system every year to try and curb what Ferrari was doing in the brilliance of Michael Schumacher. So
there was Parc Fermé, there was the engines 1 per weekend, then 2 per weekend.
Gearbox restrictions, all of these things that they brought in to try and curb Ferrari's performance.
Yeah, but just going back to the token system, I just wanted to point out that it's kind of like Formula E where they're talking about developing these road relevant technology, and then they bring it in and immediately freeze it, and it just seems really hypocritical in the same sense of Formula E, where it's all about showcasing green energy technology, but all the actual technology is severely restricted. I mean, you can't. These Formula One teams, they brought these new engines in, and then the token system severely limits what they can do to the architecture of their engines, and they can't really innovate. Then you've got Formula E where everything's spec anyway, so I don't understand where the innovation is besides a pure marketing grab. So the whole thing seems a bit the word's escaping me, but sort of, yeah, it's not real what they're doing.
I think it's important to remember that what Formula E will become will actually be quite a lot different than what it is today. So, I mean, it's still in its infancy.
That's true.
Yeah,
it's true.
So, what concerns me as a Formula One fan is watching, the big manufacturers talk more about Formula E. So obviously, we know Mercedes going in. Porsche's pulled out of prototype racing, and now you're moving into Formula E. And they're only lukewarm towards even considering a Formula One entry, and yet they're going whole hog into Formula E. I think that's the future. I think that's what manufacturers will do. If BMW and Toyota were thinking about a Formula Series today, I guarantee they'd be looking at Formula E and not Formula One.
Yeah,
and I think that should be alarm bells for Formula One. That new players, manufacturers coming into motorsport and looking for a place to race are actually, as it stands right now, more likely to choose Formula E.
And going back to your original question, and what Lewis has said about how Honda has come in and failed, that just underlines what a failure these regulations are, because what better demonstration of what could happen to a potential manufacturer having their name dragged through the mud than what's happened to Honda. Like, it's all a bit of a joke, to be honest, now.
And Honda have taken a bath, publicity-wise, on their partnership with McLaren. It's been very damaging to their brand.
It's produced lots of great Fernando Alonso memes, but besides that, there hasn't really been anything good that's come out of that relationship for anyone. So it's the regs have failed miserably in that sense. They've attracted one manufacturer to the sport who have demonstrated just how poor the regs are.
Despite how much money they've thrown at it.
Yeah, absolutely. So they just haven't.
And that's the other thing, is that if you believe the rumours that Honda's throwing $100 million a year at McLaren, they've spent a lot of money to...
Probably not quite enough, though.
To trash their own brand and to look like they can't do the kind of systems that are relevant to this. And we know Honda's biggest market is clearly its home market of Japan. And we know how popular Formula One is in Japan. So we can't just sit here and go, oh, people only buy Civics anyway. That's not true, because there is a very passionate motorsport community within Japan that sees that.
Not only that, but you and I both know Japanese culture relatively well, and I would say that it's a very massive hit to their reputation and sort of national. I wouldn't call it nationalistic, but these companies do sort of take pride in the stuff that they do, and so they would have lost a lot of clout, I think, domestically.
Oh, of course, it's cost people careers, which is the saddest thing. Like, it might be simplistic to look at it from the outside and say, well, why can't they just get it right? But I think that the problem is that for their first 3 years in the sport, was from their introduction in 2015 and through 2016, is that they were attempting to develop an engine when they didn't have enough tokens to develop the engine. So it's
a question of time as well. I know Lewis said that they lost all of 2014, but the reality is that Mercedes started their development program probably in 2012. As the regs were being drafted up by Ross Brawn, who happened to work for Mercedes.
Well, there was even talk that they were started even before 2012.
They had a lot of time, and if you think about it from that point of view, Honda are pretty much tracking exactly the same numbers that Mercedes have tracked.
Yeah.
In the same development time frame. So it's very unfair, but it just underlines just how hard it is for a new manufacturer to come in and catch up and be successful, because they're not there to just make the numbers, they're trying to be successful. So it's just one of those things. It just hasn't been written correctly, I think, these regulations. Too complex.
Anything to add to that, Luce?
Oh, pretty much, yeah. Just too expensive. And yeah, just too expensive.
Let me just also throw in. Am I the only person? I don't think I am. Am I the only one who absolutely detests the grid penalty system for component usage?
Oh, well, no. Of course not.
I mean, it affects.
I've hated it for years.
It affects races, and it will probably affect this year's championship. If you're saying that, and I mean, it hasn't really been spoken about so far because I actually don't think the sport likes to focus on it too much. So there's probably instructions to the commentators to not really talk about it. But
well, it wouldn't surprise me.
Well,
if they've done other stuff, especially when the new engines came out. They forced commentators to say, "Oh, look how great they sound." Well, listen to how great they sound. It wouldn't surprise me.
I've only really watched Formula One like religiously since 2005. It was the first year I watched the full season, and that irritated me no end when I would turn on the TV to watch a race and Kimi started from 10th or whatever because he's had a grid penalty because his engine's blown up in practice. I'm just like, that's just ridiculous.
You know, there's a, you know, it's a, I wouldn't even know how to frame it, but the problem for me is that we could very well see this championship this year. We could see, you know, at the moment it's tracking very, very similarly in terms of the you know, Ferrari's fast in some places, Mercedes is fast in others. But if you look at component usage, the red light's flashing for Ferrari. Like they are on the borderline of starting to take their 5-place, 10-place, 15-place grid penalties for component usage. Yeah, they are.
Possibly.
Particularly,
I heard that they fixed the turbos though.
Yeah, but they've already used 4, so they're going to be using those 4 turbos for the rest of the year, or they're going to take a penalty. Whereas Mercedes, I think, are only 2 component usages in, you know, at the halfway point of the season.
I don't know.
They are tracking beautifully.
We shouldn't be talking about this in Formula One. It's the richest sport, and yet I could go to a kart race and have to compete with people who could use 3 or 4 engines in a weekend and be constantly fixing and putting new ones in.
Yeah.
Formula One's the sport with all the money, and the regs are all back to front.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, I think that plays into something I've always believed, which is that I can't believe that this sport, like you said, has so much money, and yet they introduce these things and they say, okay, we're going to introduce capped component usage to save money. Okay, so you're not out there.
It just doesn't.
And they just keep introducing regulations that spend more money. Like,
yes.
If they had
it's a design effort to make a component that performs and lasts that long. It's not going to fix anything.
And teams were complaining about that when they introduced those rules in, was it 2004 or 5? They started,
2003 had to make a master race distance.
And they were saying straight away, it costs, you know, I think it was some staggering amount. Like a normal engine usually costs them, I think it was something like 5 mil or something. And then to develop the new ones, it cost them 25. And so I couldn't imagine what these were, and these were just V10 engines. I couldn't imagine what the cost nowadays is.
Oh yeah, of course, it's astronomical.
But it used to be, right. Even when you had the engine regulations of the mid 2000s, and you spoke about Kimi losing a championship pretty much on the back of grid penalties from engine failures, you know, in 05. Yeah, it's different when you've got, okay, this is the engine, and if you change the engine, you're going to take a 10-place grid penalty. Now it's like, oh, you've got the turbo, you've got the MGUH, you've got the MGUK, you've got the power store, you've got the ICE. So theoretically, you could be taking penalties at every single race from race 5 onwards kind of thing, because you're changing one component. So then what you have is the teams go, well, screw it, we're going to take a penalty, so we'll just replace absolutely everything in it and add a new one to the pool and just take whatever penalty, you know, we can get at the end of it. And not only does it actually flies against the concept of the rules, like it's gaming the system, but it's just dumb. Like, it's absolutely dumb to hear, oh, Fernando Alonso's got a 60-place grid penalty for taking all these these components for his car, and they're going, well, we'll strategically take them at Azerbaijan so we can have a strong race at Hungary, kind of thing. I just look at that and I just shake my head. It's
the only thing that was good, that made sense, was the Parc Fermé regulations that said, you know, you have to race with the engine that you qualify in. So
I mean, that's solved.
That's good. Get rid of qualifying engines. That doesn't make any sense. Yeah. So, I mean, that makes sense. But just having to engineer really complex engines to last so long, It's not a cost-saving measure. It never saves money. When they brought V8s in, they said it was a cost-saving measure. They would have spent hundreds of millions bringing in the V8s. I don't know what kind of cost they saved, to be honest. So,
and it stifles innovation. For me, the other big thing it does is it stifles development. Because basically you're saying, well, first of all, we can't afford to take risks on an engine when it's going to burn one of our pool. So we can't afford to push a development thing and go, hey, if this doesn't work, we might have an engine failure. Oh, that's okay. We'll bounce back in the next weekend. It's like, no, you got to carry that penalty all the way through. If you blow an engine at one race, you're gonna be taking a penalty at the next race.
Yeah, it's just another one of the things that's made it difficult for Honda, because they've wanted to get on top of their power deficit, and they haven't been able to test really new qualifying modes until the post-Hungary test. So, with the risk of blowing them up. So they've always been running the engine under power. It's such a
silly system.
I thought they had the right balance in 2007, 2008, when you could run whatever engine you wanted on Friday, and then Saturday, Sunday was part of the end. That engine had to last, and it only had to last 2 weekends as well. So I thought that was an ideal balance.
So I've been joined by Matt with his echoing microphone. So
g'day guys.
Welcome in, Matt. So we're just talking about
put yourself to push to talk, Matt.
So we've just been going over the effect of the grid penalty situation for component usage. And but what we can do is, well, hopefully we can get that echo sorted out. But what we can do is go back to we can go back and address the first questions to you that Lewis and Greg already had a look at. Give you a quick spiel about what you make of the current regulations, the hybrid regulations, and do you think what sort of competition does Formula One face from Formula E? Do you think Formula One should be pandering to the manufacturers? And do you think the current regulations have been good for the sport? So you've got a 20-minute window there to answer those questions, because it's quite a lot.
All right, I'll try and address that one point at a time.
Yeah.
Firstly, is Formula E competition for Formula One? Right now, it's definitely not, and I find it hard to believe in the near future, and by near I mean the next 10 to 20 years it would be, because I think the rate of development of electrical technology and electrical engines is a long way from producing the kind of power that we see in a combustion engine. And I think the pinnacle of motorsport will always be the one that's the fastest. And I think you'll probably agree that Formula E is a long way from being the fastest form of motorsport. And that's not going to attract the best drivers in the world.
Can I interject really quickly and say, but it is attracting the manufacturers?
It is attracting the manufacturers, but Formula One's been around for a long time. And it hasn't always been manufacturer dominated, but it's still always been the pinnacle of motorsport. So while Ferrari's in Formula One, arguably they're the top manufacturer in the world, or at least have the most romantic association with them. So I think while Ferrari are there, it will always have the attraction that it needs to for drivers, for the best drivers in the world, to want to be in Formula One. Mercedes, BMW, Jaguar can all go to Formula E, but no one grows up going, I want to drive for Jaguar, I want to drive for BMW. A lot of people grow up saying, I want to drive in Formula One for Ferrari. So it would take a lot for that to change within the next 10 to 20 years. The second part of the question, have the hybrid rules been good for Formula One? From a competition perspective, I think it's pretty obvious that that's a no. From a pure engineering perspective and the interest that's brought for me personally, yes, I think the rules have produced probably the best engines that we've ever seen in Formula One. they're probably the most powerful. They're the most fascinating from a technical point of view in how they get so much power out of such a small displacement and 2/3 of the fuel. And I've personally taken an interest in how they go about doing that and the lean combustion technologies and things that I would never have looked at had the series remained with a normally aspirated engine. However, do I think that's the way forward in the future? No, I don't think so, because of the way I see road cars going, and the way I see, and from my engineering background, what I see with autonomous vehicles and how we're supposed to design our roads in the future and how that's all going to go about, I don't see that Formula One will ever be relevant to road cars ever again. So the only way for Formula One to survive would be to be able to do so without the manufacturers. And the next engine formula, in my opinion, should look at surviving. It should look at a set of rules that does not require the big manufacturers to make it work. So getting companies like Cosworth, obviously Ferrari, I believe, would, if we were to go back to a naturally aspirated engine, I think Ferrari would stick around because they've been the biggest, or were the biggest detractors from going to a hybrid engine and a V6, and because it's completely against their road car initiative. But putting an engine formula together that suits privateers a lot more than manufacturers, and to that extent an engine formula that satisfies what the fans want, because ultimately, it's a very cliche thing to say, but ultimately the fans will be what keeps Formula One alive. I think you could probably agree with that as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll just finish up with two more questions then. So first of all, is if Formula One maintains this hybrid approach in the next engine formula, does it risk positioning itself too close to Formula E and therefore losing manufacturer support, but also alienating the fan base? What do you think about that?
I think keeping it hybrid won't align it too much with Formula E. I think Formula E is still very underdeveloped, and you know, the only thing keeping it hybrid does is keeps the manufacturers in the sport for a further 10 years, pretty much. After that, I can see the manufacturers leaving. So, you know, Formula E will never be competition for Formula One while the cars are the way they are. Formula E would have to merge into Formula One for it to be competition for Formula One. There's no way that independently they could be competition for each other. It's just, you're never going to get 1,000 horsepower out of an electric motor for 2 hours on a Sunday. It's just not going to happen. And then, you know, what kind of rules how are they going to get a Formula E car to all of a sudden have the downforce of a Formula One car, and all those things that make Formula One attractive to the best drivers in the world and the promoters and things like that.
But I guess what I'm getting at is that if Formula One remains on this trek of hybrids, and rather than looking at a simpler engine formula or at least spec parts for say your energy recovery or your MGUs or whatever, is that if the manufacturers do up and leave the sport, and you touched on this earlier, if the manufacturers up and leave the sport, who's going to supply the engines? Because otherwise Formula One actually risks becoming a single engine sport. If Ferrari's the only one there, for example, and if Ferrari will win everything all the time. So if you position it too close to Formula E and you're actually focusing on engines that are a little bit too complex for a place like for Cosworth to make them, but you're too close to Formula E and all the manufacturers are going over to make full electric rather than hybrid, how do you have engines in the back of cars at that point? Is Formula One not in a better position to actually just go, well, you know what, screw it. We'll do away with hybrid, we'll do away with the new stuff, and we'll actually just go back to a normally aspirated engine that places like Ilmor and places like Cosworth, that these small, that even Williams themselves, or Red Bull themselves, or McLaren themselves could actually just make their own engine. Okay.
Yeah, for sure. For sure, I think that's the direction they should go. They should go the naturally aspirated route. But I don't think the new 2021 engine is going to be too complex for Cosworth or for Ilmor to build, because they're sitting in those meetings as well at the moment, and they're having their say on what they think is possible.
But surely any level of complexity plays into the hands of the rich manufacturers.
But we don't know what kind of engine they're going to suggest for 2021 in terms of the hybrid component, how standardized it is. You know, it's not going to have the MGU-H part of it. It'll have the MGU-K part of it. Will that be standard? And then if that's quite a standardized part, then you're really only producing a turbo V6 or a twin turbo V6, which I think any good engine company could do. So it's really how they play the hybrid part, and by having Cosworth and Ilmor sit in on those meetings, you'd have to assume that the rule set that comes out of it would be applicable to those smaller manufacturers and enable them to build an engine so that it's not just the OEM suppliers that have a monopoly on being able to provide Formula One teams with an engine. Having said that, Ilmor did say that they were looking for someone to team up with to produce an engine for 2021. So perhaps it's still a bit too complicated, even with the reduced hybrid component. And therefore, I agree with you. We need to go, or we should go back to a simpler, naturally aspirated, high revving engine that's rev limited to stop investment into looking at how to get top end power out of them by bloody using stratospheric revs, and going to something that, yeah, Red Bull could pay Ilmor, or McLaren could pay Ricciardo, Cosworth could build an engine, Ferrari could build an engine, and there you've got 4 manufacturers there already, and goodness knows how many other manufacturers could produce naturally aspirated V10s to be in Formula One, which right now would still be the pinnacle of motorsport and a privilege to be involved in. So the hybrid thing is, you know, they have to tread very, very carefully, and I know they're trying, and it's documented that they're trying to get a formula that you know, smaller manufacturers and independents can supply engines for teams like Red Bull, who have been whinging about the lack of choice, and you know, McLaren are stuck in that situation as well at the moment. So they've got a really big job if they're going to stick with hybrids in working out what the exact formula is to keep everyone involved.
All right, and so first to you, Luce. How would you react to the things that Matt said? Do you agree or disagree?
Well, I think we share pretty much the exact same opinion on just about everything there. I think F1 sort of certainly needs to move into a direction where it appeals to, obviously, engine manufacturers outside of F1 currently, so they can come in and make an engine that's simple and cheap enough that perhaps, you know, if McLaren, Red Bull, and even Williams and the like, obviously, if they're not happy with the engines they get, that perhaps, you know, with a bit of investment, they could, you know, try and make their own. So I think whether that is a V8, V10, V12, or even, you know, some kind of turbo, V4, V6 turbo, you know, as long as it's cheap and offers, you know, fair amount of power, I think, and all the engines are competitive. I think if we can produce something like that, even if it does mean going back, I think it'll be a positive, a massive positive for F1.
All right, Greg, and how would you react to that?
Yeah, I mostly agree with everything that Matt said. I don't think they'll take their aggressive step, but the problem is that at every stage in Formula One's history, I don't think there's been many times when everyone could possibly agree on an issue. There's always competing issues, and there's always, the big teams, the people with the money are interested in protecting their advantage. So I know there's obviously a lot of people sitting in on these engine meetings, and there's a lot of talk going on, but I don't know if it'll be possible to make everyone happy. So that I don't know what the end result will be, but I feel like Formula One, whoever's in charge of Formula One at that time, will probably have to make a decision about who they want to make happy. Whether that's the engine manufacturers, the incumbent teams, or the independent engine manufacturers that are at this stage, they're only thinking about making an engine fair. They haven't committed to anything, so it won't be an easy decision.
And we'll be having this conversation again in, 6-7 years time.
It'll just be a constant conversation.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, as I was saying before, it all points to the manufacturers leaving one day.
Yep.
That's what I think.
Yeah, me too.
They have in the past, and they will in the future. It's just a constant. It's one of the constants of F1. I think they come in and they serve their purpose of obviously promoting their brand or winning some races, and then they say it's too expensive and they want to pursue other things. Just happens.
And they need to, and the people who are making the decisions need to work out whether they can see a Formula One without manufacturers. And that's a very tough choice when they're pouring a lot of money into the sport at the moment and, creating a lot of exposure. I can understand that's an extremely tough choice. But, we either have the conversation now about the manufacturers thing or we have it in 10 years' time. And I don't see the point in kicking the can down the road to do it while Formula One's still riding on a high at the moment. We might as well use this momentum and go into an era where we're not relying on manufacturers while we can, because in 10 years' time, you don't know what it's going to be like. We could have these twin-turbo V6s come in with a smaller hybrid component, and for whatever reason, they don't capture the imagination of the fans. They don't, we end up with more disparity if they get it wrong. You just don't know what's on. Yeah, exactly. You don't know what's going to happen. I mean, they're making a decision now for 3 years' time. In 3 years' time. Like, a lot's going to happen in 3 years. A lot. But one thing will be constant. No one's going to get over the sound of a V12 or a V10 or a V8.
Yeah, it happens on every video on YouTube you watch. Someone will watch a video from the current day and then they'll click on a link of a V10 going around a track and just scream. And every time you can see it in the comments, man, I love this sound. Every time.
And so, that will always be like that.
So does it come down to a basic decision for Formula One, though, in that when it looks at its next set of the regulations for in 3 years' time, like you said, for 2021, do they need to make the decision to pander to the fans or pander to the manufacturers?
That's where I was getting at. Yes.
Yeah, because I don't think there's a. Well, I'm not sure what the common ground is, because if you went and asked the fans and you said to them, would you prefer the hybrid engines of today and for the big teams, if you just said if you prefer the hybrid engines today in terms of sound and what you want these cars to be, or would you like to see us go back to a V8 or a V10, I think you would find that more than 70% of the fans would say they would much prefer to go back to a V8 at minimum.
Yeah, at the expense of losing the manufacturers.
Yes.
I think people will make that trade-off every day of the week.
Not only that, when you think of the teams that the sport, that the fans love Ferrari because Ferrari is Formula One. They love McLaren. They love...
And Williams and McLaren are very similar. They've got a history in Formula One. They're both passionate about the sport, and they've got fans that back it up.
I mean, let's be clear. These teams don't win without having a very, very good donkey in the back. Like, McLaren's best years came with Mercedes, and before that came with Honda. Williams won when they were partnered up with Renault. They're a crucial part of the car. But at the same time, if you said to people, what team do you love more? Do you love Mercedes or do you love McLaren? I think you would find even Sauber has a more loyal fan base than Mercedes does.
Mercedes only been around for what?
Correct. I mean, Sauber's
7 years.
been in the sport for near on 20. Well, it's actually written on the side of the car this year. It's 25 years. So, and they were survived being bought out by a manufacturer and then sold back to Peter for $1. So, I think that for me personally, I would love to see the sport put more focus on these privateer teams. And yes, I would consider Ferrari to be a privateer team for Formula One, because they're not just in it for the short haul. Renault, Mercedes, Honda. I wouldn't give these guys a bigger say at the table than I would to Peter Sauber or Frank Williams as an example.
Yeah, I agree. And the thing is, someone needs to recognise that Formula One has survived without manufacturers before. So giving them a majority say in what happens is giving them power to destroy the sport, basically, when they choose to walk out. And I know that's a tough decision given the money involved. But like you just said, the fans have an affinity with teams and history. And, Mercedes history it's recent history. No one fucking remembers 1950 when they won before that. They remember him as an engine manufacturer in the back of McLaren,
and they didn't even make the engines half the time.
Exactly, it was an Ilmor engine with a Mercedes badge on it. And I mean, if you talk to people today, like the common guy off the street, 9 out of 10 people still think McLaren and Mercedes are the same thing. So, Mercedes in terms of history in Formula One and attraction, it's they're still related to McLaren. McLaren still hold their cards with Mercedes. So I think, I don't know how you can portray that message to them without chucking them out of the sport immediately. But it kind of looks like that's the only way forward if they were to go down a non-hybrid route.
Greg, how would you react to that?
I'm sorry, I wasn't able to follow that.
Ah, jeez. All right, moving right along then. All right, so we're coming up onto an hour, and I didn't really want to push much more than an hour. So what I want to give each of you now is a minute to describe what your ideal next Formula One would look like in terms of what I want to talk about is obviously, just briefly, what your power unit looks like, or your engine, what your tyre situation looks like in terms of, have you got competition, have you got a tyre war, do you have refueling, and what level of testing would you like to see? And I'll let you go first, Greg. So try and keep it to about a minute.
It's fairly simple. I love the naturally aspirated V10. I think the tyre war is unnecessary. Testing is relatively okay the way it is. Maybe a little bit more testing. Actually, no, there should be a bit more testing than there is, but not too much more. I'm happy to keep refueling out of the sport. I think the current regs are kind of close to where they ought to be. It's just the engine formula, I would say. It would be nice to see the naturally aspirated V10 come back.
Okay, your turn, Liz. What's your ideal vision of Formula One in the next formula?
Okay, obviously we're going back to V10s. That'll be the first thing. There'll be a change in the engine rules. It'd probably go back to something similar to what they had, what Greg touched on earlier in 2007 and 8, with you can run whatever engine in practice and stuff, and then change it in qualifying. I'd not have the restrictions on engines and components as what it is now. Obviously, I'd scale that back. You can have, a new engine every 2 races, so 10 engines a year or something like that. What else would I change? That's just about it, to be honest. I mean, not far away. I just want it to be cheaper and more competitive. Tyre war, again, that's not necessary, but I'd have it open, so if, another tyre manufacturer wanted to come in, they could.
That's tyre war.
Yeah, does your ideal version of the sport have 2 tyre manufacturers? Or more?
I wouldn't say it's ideal, but I'd just say it's open. Like, it's not going to be a closed exclusive deal or anything like that. And there was something else.
So what I'm hearing is that you don't really care, tyre-wise.
Tyre-wise, no.
Okay. Refueling?
Refueling, I personally, if we're going to have tyres as they are currently, like obviously they don't wear out all that much, I would have refueling come back. But it would be a caveat. You still have to use only 100 litres or whatever the limit is per race. So you can refuel, but you can start with less fuel and then pit and put fuel in if you want.
Okay. Matt, your turn.
I'm going to need half an hour, but...
Alright.
Yeah, it's hard to summarise in 1 minute.
Yeah, but I'll go through firstly tyres. I actually wouldn't mind seeing a tyre war. I think if the tyre war is, if it's close between 2 tyre manufacturers, you do get a bit more variety. It's like having another set of compounds from an individual manufacturer, and I enjoyed 02, 03.
Seeing McLaren
04.
get thrashed by Ferrari on Bridgestones.
Well, 05 wasn't so bad, was it? And 06 was quite a good championship battle, the way that tide turned. Look, I'm indifferent to the tyre war thing. I think it could be exciting with a tyre war. But,
I think we're all part of us are all thinking of costs as well, though, when you're asking us this question. Because there's all these ideals we could have, but...
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair enough.
A tyre war nowadays, you have to remember, they were testing ridiculously on tyres. The majority of testing was tyres because, of course, the most lap time comes from tyres. And to have a tyre war now without testing, it's a big ask to tell these guys, oh yeah, come with a new set of compounds next week where you can't test them.
Yeah, I guess what I was angling at, and I probably should have framed it better to you guys, is that looking back at the past, as we've all watched Formula One over the last 10, 15, 20 years. What do you want to see be your performance differentiator? Do you want it to be in a tyre war? So sometimes cars will be more better at one track because of the tyres. Do you want it to be refueling, where it can be strategy gets you over the line? Do you want it to be an unlocking of engine regulation, so engine's your power differentiator, or do you want it to be an aero formula where technically what happens is the richest team wins?
Yeah, but the thing is, right, if we go back to 2001, it was a combination of all of those things. It was, you'd get to Monza and, Williams would be in a chance with winning because that BMW was just an amazing...
It was just power.
It's an amazing piece of kit if provided it got to the finish line. Aero was a factor because Ferrari won the world championship with the best car, and maybe not the absolute best engine, and I think it has achieving that balance is really, really tough. But engine performance has to be a factor in winning a world championship, and it shouldn't be a common part. I mean, we spoke about before, you touched on it, McLaren won with Honda, and Honda was the best engine that year. Williams won with Renault, and Renault was the engine to have. Like, Benetton had to change to Renault because that Ford V8 was a piece of shit, and Renault was the top engine. When the last era, okay, Renault maybe wasn't the most powerful, but the exhaust blowing technology that they developed with Red Bull was top class. That's what won them the title. And now Mercedes have had the best engine and they deserve to be world champions. But as you know, and Webby said it a lot of times, they don't deserve to have the advantage locked in. So it needs to be an engine formula that is able to have some performance differentiation, but controlled. And the way you would control it is, if we were to go back to a naturally aspirated engine, is to again rev limit it, number of components, fuel restrictions, things like that are likely to just close it up a little bit.
Do you homologate? Do you freeze it like the V8 era?
No, do not freeze it. I think it's been good this year having engine updates come through. Seeing Honda slowly fucking climb the ladder. At least they're climbing the ladder. Can you imagine? And I know with V10s, with the naturally aspirated engine, there shouldn't be that performance disparity. But say there is, what do you do then? You lock a poor team down the bottom because they got stuck with Cosworth.
Oh no! You do it like you did with the V8 era, which is you give them a few seasons of unlimited of development, and then as they all converge, you homologate it, you freeze it. But at that point, do you then risk new manufacturers being turned away by saying, well, there's no way we can catch up instantaneously?
Yeah, I personally think that it's an interesting point when you consider that the road relevance is going to go away more and more and more, and what's really the point in keeping to develop a naturally aspirated combustion engine? There isn't too much point, but from a sport perspective, I think you need to have that war. You need to have that technological war for it to be
Formula
interesting.
1.
Exactly, that's Formula One. That's why people love it, and I think you can minimize it from the engine side to avoid spiraling costs, but you should never take it away, and it should never not be a performance differentiator in some small way.
Yep.
And then going back to a naturally aspirated engine fixes a lot of other things as well. It reduces the weight of the cars quite a bit, which means that you don't probably need so much downforce on them, which taking a bit of downforce off will help with the overtaking side of things. And they've got the wide tires now, which is great. So it's really just little tweaks that hinge around the engine formula, really. I mean, can you imagine these cars now with this downforce level minus 100 kilos from pissing off the hybrid component? It'd be amazing to watch.
Yeah.
The engine formula is critical, really critical in also the car dynamics of it. Refueling, personally, I'd prefer to have no refueling still. I think it
was an improvement.
Yeah, I think it was an improvement as well. I think we see drivers having to crack a bit more, not waiting for the pit stop so much.
Yep.
And at least if you're going to undercut someone, it's still a guessing game. You're not forced to pit. You can hang out as long as you can so you don't get undercut. Whereas, if you refueled it a little bit short at the start of the race, there's nothing you can do. You got to pit. So I think strategically it's a bit more interesting to have no refueling. That's probably all of them, isn't it?
Testing.
The main ones. Testing, I'd probably have...
There needs to be more, I reckon. Not, as Greg said, there's got to be more, but I don't think... You don't want too much where it's just going to advantage the top teams.
I think that's something they really need to work out with the teams, because we're not... Like Greg said, we're thinking about cost as well. I mean, yeah, it'd be great to have more testing, but personally, I'd like to see something introduced maybe on the Friday, have an extra 1 hour session for young drivers only, or
they've tried that.
Maybe the Monday after, a few more of these after race tests, like the Hungary one. Something like that. Maybe the Friday's a bit of a bullshit one, like Greg said, because you end up just focusing on the race. But after the race, you see people validating things, and I think a few more post Grand Prix tests probably wouldn't go astray. But testing's not something we see too much of, apart from the scrutiny that winter testing gets. So
there's not enough winter testing. They keep shortening the winter season, and it's taking away what I think was one of the most exciting parts of the year for all of us.
Certainly builds the anticipation.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, Matt managed to keep that to about 10 minutes, not 30. So good job, Matt. So,
no worries.
All right. I'll power through mine really quickly. Mine would be a naturally aspirated V8 V10, V8 at a pinch. It would be not so much restricted as per you can only use a certain number of engines per season, but it would definitely be Parc Fermé regulation so that you can't have qualifying grenades. I think in terms of refueling, if you had have asked me last year, I would have said definitely refueling, but I think the tyres this year have been so much better. I shouldn't say last year to this year, but the previous regulation where it was only 2 compounds, but now they've got the 3 compounds. I think that adds a strategy element that was missing prior to 2016. So I'm not so fussed on refueling anymore. Tyre war, I think, would be really, really interesting. And I think that the way you achieve that is by, as Matt touched on, actually having testing after a race at the European rounds, so it's really cheap for the teams. So for the smaller teams, they're not having to transport specifically to go somewhere, they're already going to be there. You would allow the teams to then run componentry that doesn't come out of any kind of bank, although as I said, in my scenario, you wouldn't have the bank. And you would ask, well, you could definitely look at saying these tests should be run by junior drivers, because I think that there's very, very limited testing opportunities available to juniors nowadays. So I'd like to see more of that. And I also think that having those tests would help with mid-season development. So I'm definitely down for that. And I'm also with Greg that I would like to see at least one more week of winter testing, if not 2 more weeks of winter testing, because I think it's good for the sport. And I think that it would help teams iron out a few of their things before they get going. And there's no reason why they can't just have a full week at Barcelona, and then the next week's another full week of Barcelona, so they don't have to continuously transport around. They can avoid a lot of costs. So in about 30 seconds, that would be my ideal picture of the sport. Did I miss anything?
With your testing thing,
Yep.
we need, I think, as well as young drivers, I think you need to give your third drivers a crack. So your Durestas
yeah, definitely. So I meant that as the young drivers, but you're of course right, because what we've got at the moment is a problem where your standby drivers like Duresta at Hungary haven't driven the car for 3 years. Like, that's a problem. Like, what's the point of having a third driver? You might as well not have the car in the race. Because
they're not going to score points. They're that out of touch with it. And, they're fantastic drivers, but no one can work miracles in a short space of time. So
I'd also really, really like to see FOM use that opportunity to broadcast the tests, so it doesn't violate any existing rules of telecasting the races. To broadcast those tests in some way, shape, or form, and use it to allow the fans to get a more behind-the-scenes view of the sport that's not on a race day. I think that there's a good marketing opportunity there for them with that. All right, well, I think we've tripped over an hour now. I blame Matt. Sorry,
guys. Valuable input.
Dear. So we'll wind it up there. Thank you very much for your contributions. I think we went over a lot of stuff tonight. I think at the end of the day, we probably mostly agree on these things. So we'll finish up with some final thoughts. Is there anything you'd like to say finally, Luce?
No, I think we've touched on just about everything. Obviously, just want it more competitive, louder sounding cars. You want to feel the engines. I don't know for many of our listeners out there if they've ever been to a Grand Prix which had V8 or even V10 engines, but I'm not sure you get the same experience with the current ones, where you could feel with V8 engines, it would go through your body, it would vibrate grandstands when the cars are 200 meters away. It was an amazing experience, and I think that's something F1's lost. So if we can make it cheaper and get those engines back and have racing more competitive again, I think it's just a win, even if it is a step away from being road relevant.
Okay, Greg?
Yeah, I think F1 just needs to... I know that doesn't like looking at the past, but it needs to look back and have a think about like what Matt said, about what inspires, I guess, what excites, and I think the sound's a big part of that. So they need to figure out a way to... I know it's probably impossible, but a way to make everyone happy. Come to some kind of reasonable compromise.
Very good. That sounds like a reasonable goal. All right, and finally, you, Matt.
Sorry, I don't want to go back, but what did you say about the Halo? Is anyone?
Brought up. We've been trying to. We tried not to mention it.
Yeah, we did.
We've been ignoring it.
It is literally the elephant in the room. Like, it's the Halo. The Halo.
I'm an advocate for the Halo. I actually prefer that to the windscreens that we've been fucking looking at. I reckon the Halo is, if you watch the FIA video, and if you think about what Formula One would be if it had some sort of screen like what was shown, or even a closed cockpit, I think the Halo is definitely the best of some dodgy solutions.
But it's like choosing which arm you'd like to have cut off. Like, neither of them are good solutions.
It is, but I think the Halo over time we're a chance of getting used to, because aesthetically, while it's not amazing, it could it could develop into something that's more functional than and more aerodynamic looking than it currently is. But you need to give it the time. And you know, I think we've gotten used to worse things than that, to be honest. Like the dick on the end of the noses.
Yeah, but that's gone now.
It is gone, but we stuck at
just like the Halo should be. It's gone.
You can't get rid of it, but
Yes, you can.
it hasn't even come in yet. Just let common sense prevail. You know, my argument against the Halo is that the last two major incidents we've seen in Formula One, it wouldn't have saved Jules, and it wouldn't have helped Felipe. In fact, it actually risked, you know, deflecting that spring to hit Felipe in the chest, which could have killed him. So anything where you add something that has a flat surface that can actually deflect something downwards into the cockpit, I think is a horrendous decision. But obviously the people at the FIA are smarter than I am. So
That's debatable.
that video that they released showed they went through a lot of accidents and showed that the effect was neutral or positive in a majority of cases.
I'm sure that they weren't biased in any way, shape or form.
Well, you can judge for yourself from
Yeah.
the video whether you thought that the Halo, whether you agreed with the FIA ranking for that. My point is, why do you have to wait for something to happen to do something about it?
I think that there's a certain... none of us are going to sit here and advocate for drivers getting hurt, but I think that there has to be a certain understanding that some sports you do at your own risk. And if you want to fundamentally change the sport to remove that risk, I just don't know. I just don't know at what point does the sport stop being what it is and start being something else. None of us want to see drivers get hurt. Let's make that very, very clear. But at the same time, none of us want to see something as stupid looking as the Halo on a Formula One car, because I think that going to something that fundamentally changes an open wheel race car does affect the pinnacle of the sport. Because for me, the pinnacle of racing is a Formula car, an open wheel, open cockpit race car, the fastest in the world. And they argue that they say, well, it would have saved Justin Wilson. I don't argue against that. It would have saved Surtees, Henry Surtees. I don't argue with that. But at the same time, there's probably other things you can do. The reason that Henry Surtees was killed was because the wheel tethers didn't work. Okay, so fix the wheel tethers. The reason that Justin Wilson got killed is because the wing broke in a way it wasn't supposed to break. Okay, so fix the wing. Why do we have to fundamentally change the sport to put a halo on the car when what you're trying to do is stop something where it was another component that wasn't done correctly? And if we go back to Felipe's one, which was a legitimate spring broke off the car, there was no way you can stop that from happening. I think that the halo risked adding a deflection point that could have killed him. So, as I said, FIA probably smarter than I am, but I just look at the halo and I don't see it as inevitable that the halo will save somebody. I don't see it as inevitable that if you don't install the halo, someone's going to get killed. I don't think those things. I don't think those things are a certainty. So, Greg, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. I've made all those same arguments. Just at some point, you just got to say it's dangerous. Motorsport is dangerous.
It says it on the ticket.
Yeah, I mean, if open cockpit is so dangerous that you need to add a halo, then maybe you don't want to do open wheel racing anymore.
That's the argument I try and make. I hear drivers talk about, well, if you don't like it, why don't you go drive, an LMP1 car or an LMP2 car or a GT3 car or something? Like, there's other options out there if you're not comfortable with it.
But can you see what the position the FIA is in?
Of course I can.
Their position is an accident has to happen first, and then they knee-jerk react to it, which is what I think this is. I don't think they've ever been proactive in protecting a driver.
But this has been developed since 2011. They've started looking at this. It's 6 years in the making.
Yeah, I mean, drivers have died though.
But
before they've looked at this.
But there's no. Even now, after you said it's been development for 6 years, it's been, the drivers have been showed this video. There's still not universal acceptance. It's a good thing to do. So, yes.
There's not universal acceptance about how it looks. There's universal
I don't think there's
that
universal acceptance of how effective it is either.
Especially when they've changed the ruling where, you know, the timing of drivers to get out of a car. They bring in something saying it's safer, and then something that actually is a risk. You know, a driver might need to get out of the car because it's...
Oh, no, the FIA's cut a deal with fire to burn slower.
And then, well, okay, let's take that out of it. And let's say he's injured his back, broken his back or leg. How the hell's he going to get out safely without damaging it further with a halo there?
Oh, well, if he's got a halo, he's not going to be going anywhere with a broken back, with or without the halo.
Yeah, I don't doubt that stuff's... I don't look at it that way.
Extraction could be an issue.
Yeah.
They've sorted that out. They've done it. It's in the video. They've done a mock-up of it. The driver extraction's exactly the same. The time was cut because and this is where it's a little bit contradictory, because like Webby was saying before, you know, we've got wheel tethers, we've got other things that stop components coming loose and hitting people in the head. So with the extraction time, the FIA, their reasoning was that, well, countermeasures are in place now for fires not to happen. Everything, you know, the fuel tank doesn't blow up like it used to. You know, it's a Kevlar. You know, fire's not really a risk anymore, and that was their reasoning for extending the extraction time.
That'll be their reasoning until someone's severely injured by fire, and then that'll be the new thing that they'll be all over trying to fix.
or a driver gets electrocuted by damage to the hybrid system and couldn't get out of the car fast enough.
Ban hybrids.
Well, yeah, I don't think we should be having hybrids, but that's a personal opinion. So, anyway, we get lost in the weeds on this Halo stuff. I think it will be very difficult for me to accept the Halos being part of the sport. I think that they are a fundamental change to the concept of open wheel racing.
Not Formula One.
I think that if they put a V10 in the back of this thing and had a Halo, you would not think twice about the Halo.
I disagree.
I'll take the Halo if I can get a V10 in the back.
Yeah, I think everyone would.
No. Sorry, no.
It's
no.
contradictory in the sense that we've seen the Jordan pictures from 02 or whatever, where they were 01, where they were banned on the basis of obstructing driver visibility.
And it wasn't just them. Like Arrows had similar things. BMW Sauber in 2006 had similar things. And they've had stuff like that before.
So the Halo is full of contradictions, in my opinion, that don't quite stack up in favour of having it.
I completely agree with that, and I'm not a fan of it over and above what we have at the moment. But as far as the solutions I've seen go, this is, if we had to have one, this is the one that we should have.
It should be, if we're thinking high tech, then maybe something like a point defense laser or something like that shoots debris as it comes at the driver.
I hear the Israelis and Russians have some pretty good ones.
Yeah, yep, absolutely.
I'd like to welcome the Mossad to the.
They're always listening anyway, mate.
Jeez. Oh dear.
So anyway, I'll finish with my final thoughts. I just wanted to dig that one up.
Okay.
Yeah. So. Final thoughts. Well, gonna be tough, isn't it?
That's very, very poignant there on that.
It's gonna be a tough decision. Nah, look, seriously, I think what it comes down to is how far ahead they're thinking into the future. That's what it comes down to. If they're thinking 10 years into the future, I think it's obvious that you need to go back to an independent, easily constructible, naturally aspirated engine that pleases the fans, which will be bringing in the money, and ditch the manufacturers. I have a feeling that they're going to be more short-term than that. Ross Brawn's always said, I want a 3-year, 4-year plan. And a 3-year, 4-year plan, when you've got Aston Martin and all those guys sniffing around, is to keep the hybrids. So I think whether we like it or not, we're going to have some sort of twin-turbo V6 hybrid for 2021, and we'll have to suck it up until the next meeting for 2030.
After we've had a global financial crisis and they've all left again.
Yeah, I think that you risk leaving it too long. My final thought is that I just hope that when the next regulations are written, that Formula One actually takes the time to canvass the fans for what they want, because at the end of the day, the sport doesn't live and die at manufacturer participation. It lives and dies off fan participation. If no one's going to the races, no one cares who's racing in it. So I think that the important thing for Formula One to do is to, at a reasonable level, I mean, you don't want to risk the thing where it's Homer designing the car. You know what I mean? Like it comes out and it's just this disgusting product. But I think at the same time, I think it's absolutely vital that Formula One takes what the fans want into account this time around, because I think they took a backward step with the latest regulations, and I honestly think it's hurt them. So Liberty Media is certainly making steps to correct that with its social media presence and all those kinds of things to engage with the young people today. But there are a number of people who have walked away from the sport with the current regulation set. So I do hope that they decide that fans are the ones they have to keep happy, not Mercedes, not Renault, not Honda. It's the fans. And I didn't say Ferrari because generally what Ferrari wants is what the fans want anyway. I think history's shown us that. So I think that's my final
was
thought.
a great example of that.
What do you mean by that?
Indy 05.
Ferrari had nothing to do about that.
I'll tell you one story.
Okay, all right. Well, keep it to 4.5 minutes.
No. I think Greg knows what I mean.
He's quoting Michael Schumacher in the press conference
All right.
after that race.
All right. Well, we'll call it there then. We've almost hit an hour and a half. I didn't want to go more than an hour, so that's good. But the Halo discussion dragged us out. So, but I think it's an important discussion to have because it is something that we actually don't agree on. So we agreed on pretty much everything else. So it was good to have a counterpoint in there. So thanks to everybody who tuned in, and thanks to everybody who gives us a listen. Be sure to leave us a review on iTunes or on whatever platform you're using. And this has been the Wall of Champions and Greg. And enjoy the rest of your summer break, and we'll talk to you again after Spa.